What if the greatest story ever told began with a silence? Not a silence of sound, but of absence, a missing thread in the fabric of our origins. From the moment we open the Bible, we're drawn into a narrative filled with names: Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, Seth. We learn about the first sin, the first murder, the first exile. But something is off. Something is missing. The Bible tells us that Adam lived 930 years and had sons and daughters. That fact, quietly placed in Genesis 5:4, is not speculation, it's scripture. And yet, while we know the names of his sons, we're told almost nothing about his daughters. No names, no stories, no legacy, just a silence that stretches across centuries. Why? That's not just a historical gap, it's a spiritual tension. Because without women, there is no humanity. Without the daughters of Eve, there would be no wives for Cain or Seth, no generations to follow, no families, no nations, no you. And yet their names are lost, or were they taken, erased, overlooked? Did ancient scribes make a choice to exclude them, or were their stories buried by time and tradition? For anyone who has ever felt forgotten, invisible, or left out of the bigger story, this mystery reaches deeper than history. It touches the very question of who gets remembered and who gets left behind. And maybe that's why this question matters so much today. In a world where many still feel voiceless, erased, or unseen, the silence surrounding Eve's daughters invites us to look closer. Not just at the text, but at the God who sees what others overlook. Because what if the first mothers of humanity were not forgotten by heaven, only by man? Stay with me, because what we're about to uncover isn't just about ancient names or lost genealogies. It's about identity, legacy, and the mystery of a God who weaves redemption even through silence. If you've ever wanted to see the Bible with new eyes, this is the moment to begin. Like the video if this stirs something in you. Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because this mystery goes far deeper than you think. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the one we've been told, but the one we were never meant to forget. The fall and the first family. They were the first humans to bury a dream. Adam and Eve, once walking with God in perfect communion, were driven east of Eden into a world unfit for paradise. But they didn't disappear. They endured. And that endurance gave birth to something sacred and scarred the first family. No longer clothed in light, they wrapped themselves in survival. The ground resisted them, thorns replaced fruit, and pain entered the womb. And yet, in the dust and toil of a broken world, life began again. The Bible tells us that Adam lived 930 years and had sons and daughters, Genesis 5:4. That simple phrase often goes unnoticed, but it holds a silent multitude. While we know the names of Cain, Abel, and Seth, the rest remain unnamed, like shadows just outside the edge of the story. Why does Scripture so rich with genealogies fall silent here? Was it cultural bias, divine intent, or something lost between generations? It's easy to imagine those early years as a kind of wilderness parenting, raising children not just in a physical wilderness, but a spiritual one. No church, no scripture, no sacred traditions, just memory. A memory of what was lost, and a hope, however fragile, that God had not abandoned them. Imagine Eve carrying a child under a sky no longer lit by God's direct presence. Imagine Adam teaching his sons to till the cursed earth while wondering how long the ground would echo the consequence of his choice. This wasn't a mythic scene painted in perfection. This was sweat, blood, longing, and labor. And in the midst of it, more than 3 children were born. More than 3 lives shaped the future. So why have we only been told part of the story? The silence surrounding the daughters of Adam and Eve raises more than curiosity, it demands investigation. Because as the story continues, we find ourselves staring into one of the most puzzling and often overlooked details in all of Scripture: Cain's curse and the mystery of his wife. Cain's story is one of unresolved pain. The Bible paints him not as a monster, but as a man torn between desire and disappointment. When his offering was rejected and his brother's was accepted, it wasn't just jealousy that stirred, it was the ache of not being seen. God spoke to Cain not in anger, but with a warning: if you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. Genesis 4:7. It was an invitation to turn around. But Cain didn't. He lured his brother to the field, and in the silence of the earth, envy struck down innocence. That act, the first murder, changed the course of human history. But what followed may be even more unsettling. When God pronounced Cain's punishment, Cain didn't argue the judgment. He feared the consequences. "Whoever finds me will kill me," he cried. Genesis 4:14. That single sentence breaks the logic of a world with only 3 named people. Who was he afraid of? And then just a few verses later, we read, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Genesis 4:17. No name, no background, just a woman suddenly there, as if summoned from the edges of the narrative. Who was she? 3 possibilities have echoed through generations. The first, most accepted by traditional theology, is that Cain married one of his sisters, one of the many unnamed daughters of Adam and Eve. In those early days, there were no laws forbidding such unions. Humanity was still pure, uncorrupted by generations of decay. And without that early intermarriage, no line could have continued. Even the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, would later marry within their own family lines. The second hypothesis pushes the boundary that God may have created other human beings apart from Adam and Eve. While speculative and not directly supported by Scripture, some suggest this explains Cain's fear, his wife in the city he builds. But this view raises deep theological tensions. If humanity did not come solely from Adam, then the fall, and with it, the universal need for redemption through Christ, becomes fragmented. Paul's words in Acts 17:26 are clear. From one man he made all nations. Rejecting that foundation risks undoing the entire framework of salvation history. But there's a third possibility, one found not in Genesis, but in a text revered by ancient Jewish communities and early Christians alike. A book known as the Book of Jubilees. And what it reveals might change everything we thought we knew about Cain, his wife, and the daughters of Eve. Let's take a closer look at the names the Bible never gave us, but history refused to forget. The lost names revealed. Long before printing presses and chaptered Bibles, faithful communities preserved stories not found in Genesis, stories whispered across generations and eventually written in scrolls, like the Book of Jubilees. Revered by the Ethiopian Church and referenced by early Christians, Jubilees retells much of Genesis, but with stunning additions. Among them names of the daughters of Adam and Eve. Names the Bible never gives, but that tradition never truly lost. According to Jubilees, Cain's wife was named Awan. Her name in ancient Hebrew carries layered meanings: vice, iniquity, but also desire and strength. She was not just his wife, but also his sister, born 6 years after Cain. And she, like him, was cast into exile. Together they bore a son, Enoch, not to be confused with the righteous Enoch of Seth's line and built a city named after him. It's tempting to view Awan as a footnote in Cain's darker legacy, but she was more than that. She was the mother of the first city builder, a woman who bore life in the wake of a curse, a woman who stood beside a man marked not only by sin, but by divine mercy. Then comes Azura. The Book of Jubilees tells us she was first promised to Abel. After his murder, she was given to Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. Her name echoes the deep blue of the sky, linked to lapis lazuli, a stone associated with purity, truth, and divine favor in ancient cultures. From their union came Enosh, a man Scripture credits with one of the most pivotal spiritual moments in early human history. Genesis 4:26 records, "Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord." Through Azura's line, humanity remembered God again. Worship was not merely private, it became public, communal. Her legacy was not just biological, it was spiritual. What unfolds here is not just a genealogical correction. It's a reframing of the human story. Awan and Azura aren't just wives, they are symbolic mothers of two destinies. Awan, bound to a cursed lineage, represents the path of exile, of pride of civilization built apart from God. Azura, entrusted with the righteous line, carries the seed of restoration, the sacred memory of communion. And yet you have likely never heard their names in a sermon, a Bible study, or a devotional. Why? Were they excluded because of ancient cultural norms, or because their names challenge the simplicity of a male-only narrative? Maybe the better question is, what does it say about us that we're only now asking about the women who were there from the very beginning? These lost names are not just a correction to a forgotten family tree, they are an invitation to see that what's hidden isn't always absent, and what's unnamed isn't always unimportant. But the contrast between Awan and Azura goes deeper still, because from their children come two lineages and two radically different futures. Two lineages, one lost, one redeemed. The line of Cain through Awan is marked by innovation and devastation. They were the first to build, the first to organize, the first to shape civilization. Tubal-Cain forged tools of bronze and iron. Jubal became the father of music. The descendants of Cain gave humanity cities, technology, art. But with progress came pride. These were not people who forgot God. By accident, they built a world without Him on purpose. Their culture celebrated strength, domination, and eventually corruption. And it all began with a man who walked away from God and a woman who followed him into exile. In contrast, the line of Seth and Azura unfolds with quiet reverence. This is the lineage that remembers. Enoch walked with God. Methuselah passed down the tradition. And then came Noah, the last man in a collapsing world, who still carried the light of Azura's legacy. This line wasn't perfect, but it was faithful. And it was through this line that God preserved His promise. It's a powerful spiritual metaphor, two lineages side by side. One builds towers, the other builds altars. One boasts in its own strength, the other clings to grace. One forgets, the other remembers. And perhaps that's where the question becomes personal. Because this isn't just about ancient names or lost genealogies, it's about inheritance. Spiritual inheritance. Each of us in some way inherits from one of these lines. We are either building a life with God at the center or around ourselves. We either carry memory or we walk in forgetfulness. And in that contrast, a new question arises, one that stretches far beyond Cain and Seth, beyond Awan and Azura. What happens when the lines begin to blur? When righteousness mixes with rebellion? When the daughters of God and the sons of man are no longer separate? That question leads us to one of the most mysterious and troubling passages in the entire Bible. One where giants walk the earth, angels fall from heaven, and the pure lineage of Azura is threatened like never before. The daughters who carried the world. By the time we reach Genesis 6, something tragic has already taken root. But before that descent, we must pause to recognize a truth hidden in plain sight. The daughters of Eve were not rare, they were many. Genesis 5:4 clearly states that Adam had sons and daughters. Considering Adam lived 930 years and Eve presumably nearly as long, the number of children they bore would not have been small. And yet most remain unnamed. But just because the Bible does not name them doesn't mean they were not essential. In fact, without them, the story of humanity would have ended almost as soon as it began. Their silence in Scripture is not a reflection of their insignificance, but of the times in which these texts were written, times that recorded lineage through men. Still, these unnamed daughters were not mere figures in the background. They were wives, mothers, cultivators, memory keepers. They built the homes. They raised the next generation. They carried not only life, but identity, story, and spiritual heritage. Consider this: in the modern world, the highest recorded number of children born to a single woman is 69, Valentina Vasilyev of 18th century Russia. Across 27 pregnancies, she bore twins, triplets, and even quadruplets. And that was within a normal human lifespan. Now imagine Eve living nearly a millennium, her body untainted by generations of genetic decay, her role as the mother of all humanity unshared. Is it so hard to believe she gave birth to dozens, perhaps hundreds of children? It's not just plausible, it's likely. Science even echoes this idea. Geneticists speak of mitochondrial Eve, a theoretical common ancestor from whom all humans inherit mitochondrial DNA. While not a direct confirmation of the Genesis account, it resonates with the biblical concept of a single maternal source, one woman through whom all lineages trace back. But beyond biology lies something deeper, the spiritual lineage passed from mother to child. The daughters of Eve were not just bearers of flesh and blood, they were the early teachers of memory. The ones who would whisper the story of the garden of the voice that walked with them in the cool of the day of the loss and the promise. In a modern world that often devalues the unseen, we need to remember that these women, though unnamed, were foundational. And through them, we are all connected. Every culture, every tribe, every race. We are quite literally family. The lines that divide us today blur when we trace them back to the same beginning. And in the legacy of Eve's daughters, we see not just the origin of humanity, but the miracle of its survival. But this miracle faced a turning point. For generations, the lines of Cain and Seth existed in tension, separate destinies unfolding side by side, until the moment they began to merge. And what followed would change the world forever: the rise of the Nephilim and corruption. Genesis 6 opens with an eerie, haunting shift. It says that as men began to multiply on the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, of all whom they chose. Genesis 6:2. On the surface, it reads like a simple statement of intermarriage. But beneath it lies one of the most debated and mysterious moments in all of Scripture. Who were these sons of God? And who were these daughters of men? Many scholars interpret this as a poetic way of describing the intermarriage between the righteous line of Seth and the unrighteous line of Cain. That alone would mark a tragic blending of the holy and the profane, an abandonment of sacred separation. But ancient texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees offer a more dramatic interpretation. They speak of heavenly beings, angels, called the Watchers, who descended to earth and lusted after human women. These fallen angels, abandoning their divine place, taught mankind forbidden knowledge, sorcery, astrology, weapon-making, and war. And with the women of earth they bore children giants known as the Nephilim. These Nephilim were not just tall or strong, they were symbols of corruption. Born from a union that should never have been, they became warriors of chaos, spreading violence across the land. They were revered by men, but abhorred by God. And the women, the daughters of Eve, who had once carried the promise of worship and remembrance, now carry giants of destruction. Whether one takes these accounts as literal history or spiritual metaphor, the message is the same: when the sacred is defiled, chaos follows. The line that Azura carried, the one meant to preserve the knowledge of God, had now become vulnerable. The lineage that remembered Eden was merging with the one that had fled it. This wasn't just societal decay, it was cosmic collapse. The earth was filling with violence. Worship was drowned by war. And the grief that once belonged only to humanity now reached heaven. Genesis 6:6 says, "And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart." But in that grief, a flicker of hope remained. For not all had forgotten, not all had given in. There was still a remnant, still a bloodline that had not been completely swallowed by darkness. And it began once again with a woman, a descendant of Azura, a mother whose womb would carry the future of humanity across the floodwaters of judgment. Let's trace that thread and see what was preserved when the world was washed clean. Azura's legacy and the second beginning. The world had fallen into a darkness deeper than anyone imagined. Violence filled the earth. Giants roamed the land, birthed by unions never meant to exist. Humanity had corrupted its way spiritually, morally, even physically. But God, though grieved, did not abandon the story. He looked upon the earth and found one man, not because he was perfect, but because he remembered, because he still walked with God. That man was Noah. What often goes unspoken is that Noah's righteousness did not appear in a vacuum. He was part of a lineage, a legacy, the sacred line that began with Seth and Azura, the couple who restored the path to worship after Abel's death. Azura's faithfulness didn't end with Enoch. It flowed through generations, through Enoch, who walked with God and was taken, through Methuselah, who lived longer than any man recorded in Scripture, and finally, through Lamech, Noah's father, who gave his son a prophetic name. Noah means rest or comfort, and that comfort came not from the world, but from the promise that God was not finished. Though Azura's name disappears from the pages after Genesis's early genealogies, her legacy echoes through the ark. The ark itself is a symbol not just of protection, but of preservation. A womb upon the waters, a vessel of salvation. And within it, Noah carried the last breath of a righteous line. His wife, his sons, and their wives, 8 people in total, became the reset of humanity. Through them, the earth would begin again. The flood was not just judgment, it was mercy in motion, a second chance for the world. And while Noah is honored as the builder, we cannot forget the silent strength of the women in that ark. The wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's wife, None are named in the Genesis account, yet through their wombs the nations of the world would be born. It is through them that humanity stretched outward once again. Just like Eve, just like Awan, just like Azura. This legacy reminds us that women, though often unnamed in Scripture, were never absent from God's plan. They were the carriers of history, the preservers of worship, and the unseen roots beneath the tree of redemption. And if Azura had not raised a son to call upon the name of the Lord, the flood might have washed away more than just corruption, it might have washed away all memory of God. So as the floodwaters recede and the world begins anew, we are left with a story that doesn't end in silence, it rises from it. The daughters of Eve were not erased. They were the ones who carried the world forward. Through them, the promise endured. Their names may not appear in the pages of most Bibles, but their impact is woven through every generation that followed. Awan, Azura, and the unnamed daughters of Eve were not just passive figures in a forgotten past. They were the silent strength behind the unfolding of humanity's story. Through exile and restoration, corruption and remembrance, they carried the breath of God into a world that had turned away from Him. And though history may have erased their names, heaven never did. Maybe that's the mystery we're meant to see. That God's work is not always loud, not always named, not always recorded in the places we expect. Sometimes His greatest movements are quiet, hidden beneath the surface, preserved in wombs, whispered in homes, passed from mother to child. In a world obsessed with visibility and recognition, perhaps the story of Eve's daughters reminds us that what's unseen is not unimportant. That legacy is not just built by those who are remembered, but by those who remain faithful in silence. And maybe that's the invitation for us today. To ask not just what stories were erased from the record, but what parts of our own story we've forgotten to honor. Where in your life has God preserved a legacy through quiet faithfulness? Through people you've overlooked? Through roles that go unnamed but not unnoticed? So I'll leave you with a question. Who do you believe Cain's wife truly was? Was she Awan, as the Book of Jubilees suggests? Or do you think another theory holds truth? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this journey stirred something in you, if it helped you see Scripture with new eyes, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's hungry to rediscover what's been forgotten. Because this is just the beginning. There are still more stories waiting to be unearthed, more mysteries that once seen can never be unseen. Thank you for walking this sacred path with me today. May you carry the legacy of remembrance into your own life. And until next time, may grace lead you deeper and mystery draw you closer to the heart of God. See you soon.